In this lecture, we're going to look at the life, principal ideas, and method of Socrates, the first major philosopher whose doctrines we are going to consider in depth. In many ways, Socrates is the patron saint of philosophy, if you will. It's with Socrates that major developments in the history of philosophy get started, and he's also very significant in the sense that he is the teacher of Plato, who is one of history's greatest philosophers, and Plato is the teacher of Aristotle, another of the greatest philosophers. So Socrates begins a line of investigation that has had ramifications throughout the history of philosophy. One way that we can note the importance of Socrates is by understanding that previous philosophers are referred to, that is, philosophers prior to Socrates are referred to as the pre-Socratic thinkers, which indicates that with Socrates, a revolutionary change takes place in the subject matter and the method of philosophical inquiry. As we saw in a previous lecture, the origins of philosophy are deeply connected with speculation about the natural world, the origin of the universe, its structure, and its fundamental principles. The history of what is called pre-Socratic philosophy begins with Thales back in 585 BC and continues up until Socrates. And that history is a very contentious history, as one figure after another proposes a basic fundamental principle or set of principles to explain the structure of the cosmos. And after a period of about 200 years, that became, from the point of view of Socrates, a somewhat pointless enterprise. It reaches a dead end. It doesn't seem as if any one of these cosmological answers is definitive. And therefore, what Socrates does is turn away from those kinds of investigations. He is said to turn away from investigation of the heavens and the nature of the universe and to turn inward, to focus on the nature of the human soul. For Socrates, it is the care of the individual soul, your personal well-being, that becomes the primary focus of philosophy. Another aspect of this is that Socrates is one of the earliest philosophers to be deeply involved with what we would call ethical questions, questions about the right course of action, what's the right thing to do, questions about happiness, questions about what constitutes a good life and how can it be achieved, questions about virtue. These are all the kinds of questions which Socrates spends his entire life focused on, in contrast to the pre-Socratic thinkers who spent relatively little time on this, or who derived whatever ethical precepts they derived as kind of secondary considerations based on their more important cosmological or metaphysical foundations. I'm going to begin with a brief discussion of some of the facts surrounding the life of Socrates. In many ways, the life of Socrates and Socrates' philosophy cannot be separated. Socrates is one of the first figures to actually live his philosophical activity. But starting here creates a problem which is sometimes referred to as the Socrates problem. And the problem results from the fact that Socrates wrote nothing. His philosophical activity was completely spontaneous and completely conversational. He wrote no books, no treatises. There are no writings of Socrates. Everything we know about him comes to us from reports from other figures. And some of these figures are more reliable than others. Some of them had first-hand experience of Socrates, and others did not. And therefore, the accounts that we piece together of Socrates' life and his thinking involve trying to piece together these disparate accounts that may not completely agree with each other. And this makes it somewhat of a challenge. the idea that we can have an absolutely certain understanding of the historical Socrates is probably an exaggeration. We can know the basic facts of his life and the main thrust of his philosophy, but because we don't have a first-hand account from him, but only from others, we always have to be cautious in what conclusions we reach. Socrates was born in Athens in 469 BCE, before the Common Era, or what we used to call BC. Athens was an independent political unit, a city-state, or polis, as they called it. During the lifetime of Socrates, Athens reaches its peak of power, influence, and wealth, its golden age, if you will, and much of the life of Socrates, and later Plato, will parallel the decline of Athenian society. And this will be a great concern to Socrates and especially to Plato, as we will see. So, Socrates was the first non-aristocrat to do philosophy. He was from the middle class. His father, Sophroniscus, is often reported to have been a stonemason or a sculptor, a working person. His mother, Phaeonarete, is described by later thinkers as a midwife. Now, this is important because the function of a midwife, as were most medical procedures, these were typically performed by lower classes in Athenian society, which indicates that Socrates was not from an upper-class society. The notion that his mother was a midwife becomes relevant later on when Socrates describes himself as and his philosophical activity as the activity of an intellectual midwife, as someone who helps bring out or give birth to their ideas. Socrates marries later in life, and his wife Xanthippe probably came from a socially higher family. The reason why this is likely is because it's common for later thinkers such as Plato to present Socrates as doing philosophy pretty much all the time and neglecting his role as a working person. Socrates was also trained as a stonecutter, but he rarely goes to work, and most of the time he spends doing philosophy, which would only be possible if his family had an independent source of support. Early in his life, Socrates is associated with Archelaus, who was a pupil of one of the pre-Socratic philosophers we have not studied, Anaxagoras. And Socrates showed an early interest in science and material explanations of causation, looking at the universe in mechanical terms, basically. He later abandons this in favor of ethical and logical inquiries, and those will be the major subject of our studies. In a dialogue called the Phaedo, Plato presents Socrates as being interested early on in certain pre-Socratic ideas. This early interest in science and material explanation of causality is later abandoned, however. Socrates came to view the cosmological speculations of the 6th century and the 5th century as a kind of a chaotic jumble of conflicting systems of thought. The pre-Socratic philosophers tended to find their moral concepts in their cosmology, but Socrates thought that morality was more important than that, and the goal of his philosophy, in a way, is to give priority to the care of the soul. He was associated with the Periclean circle. This is the circle surrounding the democratically elected leader of Athens, Pericles. The Periclean circle consisted of aristocratic friends and advisors to Pericles, and there were some notorious members in this group, including Alcibiades and Callias, who we will meet again down the road, especially Alcibiades. He'll become a major figure in the apology or the defense speech of Socrates. Socrates' non-aristocratic social origin is important to his philosophy, At this time, Athens was a very snobbish, very class-based society. And despite the class disadvantages that Socrates has not coming from an upper-class family, he still manages to mingle and be accepted with the upper classes of Athenian society. And this is seen in his close association with Plato and Plato's family. As we will learn, Plato is very politically well-connected from a very highly esteemed family in Athenian society, whereas Socrates was ugly, poor, and a terrible dresser. So he's kind of this strange figure who nevertheless manages to charm his way into the upper circles of Athenian society. He must have been a widely known figure because he becomes the subject of a couple of plays by major comedic writers of the time, especially Aristophanes, who presents Socrates in a couple of different plays. The Clouds, and he also appears in a play called The Birds. And in these plays, Socrates is portrayed kind of as a sophist / con man who runs a dishonest school of rhetoric and argumentation, and who spends his time investigating things in the heavens and things under the earth. It's a very kind of slanderous, in a way, picture of what Socrates does. And it's also very funny. So if you get a chance to read The Clouds after learning a little bit about Socrates, I think you'll see that the presentation there is quite exaggerated and quite humorous. The personal characteristics of Socrates are very noteworthy. He is considered a paragon of virtue by those that he knew and those that were his friends. This is in part due to his uncompromising maintenance of his personal values and principles. And we can see this in a couple of events from the life of Socrates, one of which takes place during the trial of some Athenian generals who, during a sea battle, had failed to rescue sailors who had fallen overboard during a battle in stormy seas. Now, this became the subject of a lot of moral outrage in Athens, and when the generals returned, they were tried as a group by the Athenians and found guilty for their misdeeds of not picking up the fallen soldiers. Socrates is the only person we know who stood up and said that this trial is unjust, that it's illegal and shouldn't take place. He's the only one who pointed this out and took a stand, not necessarily in defense of the generals, but in defense of the principle of law, that what the Athenians were doing was violating their own law, which determined that everyone should have their own trial and that group trials were not permissible. Another episode in the life of Socrates that is noteworthy is the Leon of Salamis episode. Following the defeat of the Athenians in the Peloponnesian War by the Spartans, a government was set up, which was an oligarchic government. This is a government by the wealthy minority who came to be known as the 30, or the 30 tyrants. Socrates had a very contentious relationship with the 30 tyrants, and at one time they banned him from speaking with young people, presumably because of the critical approach that Socrates was training these people to adopt. The Council of 30 ordered Socrates to go pick up Leon of Salamis and bring them to the council, presumably for a summary execution. And Socrates refused. He refused because it was clearly an unjust, illegal action that the council was dictating. And fortunately for Socrates, probably the only thing that spared his life at this point was that shortly thereafter the Council of 30 was overthrown and the democracy was restored in Athens. Otherwise, it's very likely that Socrates would have lost his life because of his opposition to the 30 tyrants. Most famously, in 399 BCE, Socrates was arrested and tried on charges of not worshiping the official gods of the state and of corrupting the youth. Due to the political amnesty following the restoration of democracy by Anytus, who is one of the figures we will meet who makes the case against Socrates at his trial, Socrates could not be brought up on political charges, even though he was associated with people like Critias and Alcibiades, who were very critical of the democratic government, as was Socrates. Anytus puts forward Miletus to make the case against Socrates, and they charge Socrates, as I said, with not worshiping the official gods and corrupting the youth, which were charges that brought with them the potential sentence of death. There was a death penalty associated with these charges, which many believe was intentional and was intended to try to force Socrates to voluntarily withdraw and leave Athens because of the seriousness of the charges he faced. But as we will see when we read the account of Socrates' trial, they didn't realize exactly who they were dealing with, and this assumption will backfire dramatically. Ultimately, and perhaps most famously, Socrates was and will be, as we will see, found guilty of the charges and executed by being forced to drink hemlock poisoning. And this account we will read towards the end of the semester, but it's all part of the life of Socrates, who essentially gave his life for his principles. And we'll look more at those in just a second. This is a sculpture by Constantine Brancusi called Socrates. It's rather abstract, as you can see. And I like this image of Socrates because, in a way, it captures some of the features of Socrates in a very relatively abstract but kind of a humorous way. This sculpture seems to represent some sort of creature whose primary feature is its giant mouth in some way, constantly open. And that I think is an accurate depiction of Socrates somewhat. Socrates was a very gregarious person who loved to get into conversations with people. Here you have some of his traits to kind of give you a picture of his personality. Aside from being quite gregarious, he's also known as being ironic and humorous and having a lot of insight. People liked to hang around with him, and especially young people found him inspiring. Aside from his poverty, which I alluded to earlier, Socrates is also notoriously ugly. And this is important to some extent, and it testifies to the force of his personality, because in ancient Athenian society, great ugliness was very often linked with moral corruption. But Socrates was so virtuous that he was able to overcome these prejudices against him. He's noted for being very patriotic, very pro-Athens, very brave. There are a number of accounts of his bravery in battle. He's a very pious religious person, although by no means does he follow conventional Athenian religious beliefs. He is described by Plato as the most virtuous person of his time. And it seems clear, given the later histories written by the followers of Socrates, that almost everyone who met him was impressed by these aspects of his personality. He is a unique figure in world history, and that's why even 2,004 or 500 years later, we still begin with Socrates, because he, in a way, is the beginning of philosophy. In the apology, or the defense speech Socrates will give at his trial, he goes to great lengths to argue that he is not a sophist and should not be associated with the sophists. So we should say a few words about who these people were. These were traveling teachers of rhetoric and skills of public speaking. These were important skills in democratic Athens where if you wanted to get something done, if you wanted to engage in a legal case, you had to be able to speak in public. You represented yourself. So skills of argumentation and rhetoric were very important. And since there was no formal school system, the sophists arose to fill this void. Now, the sophists had a bit of a shady reputation. I would compare them to the way in which at least some people talk about lawyers, at least if you're being cynical. Now, of course, lawyers are important, but they also have a reputation for not really caring about the truth so much as winning the case. They will do whatever it takes to win the case, and they're motivated by making money. These are some of the same charges that were brought against the sophists, as we will see. And Socrates in the Apology will be very clear to say that that's not what he's up to. He doesn't take any money for what he does, and he cares about the truth. He doesn't just really want to win an argument. So let's look at some of the principal doctrines of the sophists so we can contrast what Socrates is doing with their activity. In ancient Athenian society, it was very important to be able to speak well in public. Ancient Athens was a democracy, so if you wanted to convince people to do something, whether it's in a legal context or in the assembly, you had to persuade the majority, and you had to get up and speak in public. And so therefore, rhetoric, or the skills of persuasive public speaking, were very important. The sophists were people who taught this. It was their job to teach young people especially these skills of public speaking that would help them get ahead in life. If you were a wealthy person in Athens, you would, if you had children, often employ a sophist to teach your children these skills of public speaking. The issue with the sophists from the Socratic point of view is that the sophists weren't interested in the truth. This is why there's an opposition between the sophists and the philosophers. The philosophers, like Socrates and Plato, are opposed to the sophists because, as philosophers, they are looking to achieve the truth about reality, whereas the sophists didn't really care about that, or at least that was their reputation. They just wanted to win and then collect their fee. And so therefore there's an opposition between the philosophers and the sophists that Socrates will comment upon in the Apology, where he makes it very clear that he is not a sophist, that he does not take money for his teachings, and that he shouldn't be associated with them and their bad reputation. The bad reputation of the sophists arose because they claimed, anyway, to be able to teach you to make any argument victorious, no matter how poor it was. And they could also teach you to make the opposite of that argument victorious. They could make you equally persuasive on any side of an issue. Now, of course, if they could do that, that would be a very, very valuable skill to have. And so this was the reputation that the sophists acquired, that they were able to make the weaker argument the stronger. And therefore, they were seen as something of a threat to Athenian society because they allowed unscrupulous people to persuade the masses to do whatever they want. And that can be a very, very dangerous thing when you have a democratic society as they did in Athens. From the philosophical point of view, sophism had at least two especially negative implications. The first is that it led to skepticism, the idea that there is no truth. The reason that it was seen to lead to skepticism is because the sophists argued that we could argue either side of an issue equally well, and that therefore there's no way to distinguish truth from mere opinion. And if all we have are opinions, then that means that there is no knowledge of how things actually are. And that's what the skeptical position is. Moreover, it was seen to lead to relativism because they rejected any notion of an external objective criterion of truth. According to the famous sophist Protagoras, we as individuals, each of us is the standard of truth. What's true for me is true for me, and I am the final arbiter of that, and what's true for you is true for you, and you are the final arbiter of that. And so therefore we lose any sense of an external objective criterion of what is true and what is false. And Protagoras is especially famous for arguing, of all things the measure is man, of existing things that they exist, of non-existing things that they do not exist. So this notion of truth is relative to each individual goes well with the notion of skepticism, that there is no one objective truth that we're all aiming at. And both of these together combine to give the sophists that kind of negative reputation, and it caused them to draw the hostility of the philosophical community in particular. Socrates does not have a fully worked out systematic philosophy. He has a few noteworthy philosophical ideas. Most importantly, he's remembered for his method, which we will look at later on in this lecture. But I want to touch on a few of his philosophical ideas to give you a sense of what he thought, and just because some of these ideas are quite interesting and perhaps a little bit controversial. Socrates' most famous claim is that the unexamined life is not worth living for a human being. To be human is to be rational. To be rational is to examine the assumptions of our lives, to examine what we take for granted, the beliefs we use to direct our activities, and the nature of our lives and happiness and virtue. This is a process that never ends for Socrates. It's something that we must be engaged in continuously. But he also believes that this is the best activity that we can engage in, because we are focusing on the most important question. And that question is, what is the right way to live? Socrates is considered a rationalist in moral philosophy, due to the primary importance he places on the role of reason in moral action. This can be summarized in the slogan, "Virtue is knowledge," which on the surface is a bit cryptic and puzzling, but actually not that hard to understand. And it's an idea that makes quite a bit of sense in the context of the framework in which Socrates is thinking. Socrates believes that the ultimate goal of life is happiness. Now, this is a word we need to talk about a little bit. In ancient Greek, the word that we translate as happiness is the word eudaimonia, and it means something a little bit different perhaps than the way we use the word happiness in modern English. Eudaimonia is a more broad or general term which refers to well-being in the broadest sense. It's the idea of a well-lived life in its entirety. It's not merely a transient kind of psychological property like we talk about today, where you could be happy one moment but unhappy the next. A person who is happy in the ancient Greek sense, a person who is eudaimon, is not going to lose that transiently in any one moment. It's a description of an entire life. So for Socrates, that's the goal. We want happiness. We want to be eudaimon, to experience eudaimonia. And he believes that the only way that we are going to be able to do that is by being virtuous. Virtue is necessary and sufficient for happiness, as opposed to all other possible goods. He would argue that money, power, fame, those things people take to lead to happiness can also, in fact, lead to their opposite. Just think of all the people whose lives are destroyed by winning the lottery. For Socrates, virtue is the key. Virtue is the key for happiness. Now, this term, virtue, also needs a bit of explanation. It's the way that we translate the ancient Greek word arete. Now, arete is, in general, excellence, and it can refer both to moral excellence or to excellence in any kind of sphere you like. In fact, it's a property that even inanimate objects can possess. A knife, for example, that performs its function of cutting very well, that is well balanced, that holds an edge, that would be an excellent knife, and we could plausibly describe that as a virtuous knife in this sense. It's a knife with arete. With respect to human action, acting excellently in any sphere requires knowledge, right? Think about a craftsman who's an excellent craftsman. Well, an excellent craftsman who knows how to make things is excellent because of the knowledge that craftsman has. So for Socrates, knowledge and arete, knowledge and excellence in general go together. So when we're talking about moral virtue or moral arete, he believes that that's going to require moral knowledge. Or to put it succinctly, you can't be good, you can't be virtuous if you don't know what goodness or virtue are. So therefore, knowledge is virtue in the sense that knowledge is the prerequisite for the attainment of virtue, and virtue is what we need for happiness. How we demonstrate that we actually have this knowledge is unique to Socrates, because he believes that if you indeed do possess moral knowledge, then you can demonstrate this by stating clearly in a definition a formula that captures the essential nature of the morally relevant concept. We're going to see this in action when we look at the dialogue The Euthyphro, for example. Euthyphro will claim that he knows all about holiness or piety. Well, Socrates says, if you know, you can tell me what it is by giving me a definition, which Euthyphro tries to do but fails to do, and therefore, by failing, demonstrates he doesn't actually know. So for Socrates, definition is the key to knowledge. It's the key to moral knowledge. And it's the key to his entire philosophy as he engages in conversations and interactions with people who claim to have moral knowledge. He seeks definitions of this moral knowledge but fails to find it. What Socrates is looking for in his search for definition is what we could call the common essence that unites all examples of, in this case, a certain moral term. For purposes of illustration, I'll use the term holy because that's going to be the main concept we're going to encounter in the Euthyphro. Now, the term holy can be used in a variety of different ways. We could talk about a holy person, a holy book, a holy place, a holy spirit, etc. There's lots of different ways we can use this term. But the insight that Socrates has is if each of these things is indeed holy, there must be some single common property that they all share. And when we express that common single property that they all share in a definition, when we give a definition of the holy in general, what we have done is captured the essence, the essential nature common to all examples of holy things. So his idea is to grasp the nature of a holy person or a holy book requires that we understand what the holy per se is. And we grasp this when we can define it in a coherent, clear way. Socrates' commitment to rationality in morality leads to some idiosyncratic doctrines that were widely criticized in the ancient world. If moral virtue is knowledge, then it would follow that vice or not being virtuous would be the result of ignorance or a lack of knowledge. Because if we knew what was the right thing to do, Socrates argues, we would do it. However, if we fail to do it, that's an indication not of being evil, but of being ignorant. We would never choose to do wrong voluntarily. We would always choose to do the right thing if, in fact, we knew what it was. So, in a way, for Socrates, if someone does the wrong thing, this is not grounds for moral disapproval, this is grounds for education. It shows that the person lacks knowledge in a certain area. Now, this idea was widely criticized, especially by Aristotle, who argues that Socrates' doctrine leaves no room for a phenomenon that we're all probably well aware of, which is weakness of the will, where you can know apparently that something is the right thing to do, but still not do it. Okay? I know someone who has very high cholesterol, and they know that they shouldn't eat certain foods, and yet they do it anyway. Now, clearly, here's a person who has knowledge, but because their will is weak, they're voluntarily choosing to do the wrong thing. For Socrates, this would be impossible, that there must be something lacking within their knowledge. If they truly knew, then they wouldn't actually take that wrong course of action. For Socrates, wisdom does not consist in a vast body of knowledge or understanding. Rather, wisdom is self-awareness. It's a self-awareness of the lack of knowledge that you have. So Socrates considers himself wiser than everyone else, not in the sense that he possesses an enormous body of knowledge, but rather he's wiser than everybody else because he is aware of his own ignorance. He knows that he knows nothing. And this makes him wiser than all other people because all other people think they have knowledge, especially about morality and virtue and the right way to live. But when you ask them and inquire into their beliefs, it turns out they don't actually have this knowledge that they claim to have. So Socrates is wiser than they are because he knows nothing. They do not. They believe that they have knowledge when they don't. And this, in fact, harms people, according to Socrates. And therefore, his method involves trying to get people to critically reflect on their beliefs in order to correct the wrong beliefs that they have and begin the search for enlightenment. It also leads us to an understanding of the Socratic method, because since Socrates believes that he has no knowledge, well, then the search for knowledge must begin with other people who claim to know. And so the conversational aspect of Socrates and his method comes out of this claim that Socrates lacks any knowledge, that the only thing he knows is that he knows nothing. The issue of the Socratic method is controversial, and many modern commentators disagree about whether there's any one standard approach that Socrates used that could be considered a method. That's probably true. He uses a variety of methods that share certain similar characteristics, but the idea that he has one absolute method is probably doubtful. Socrates himself never discussed a specific method of investigating people's beliefs. Rather, the details of this method have to be inferred. We have to reconstruct his method from the way it appears, especially in the dialogues that Plato wrote where Socrates appears. Nevertheless, it appears to be clear from these texts that Socrates has a specific goal in mind and a general manner of proceeding towards this goal, though he varies his approach depending on his audience and the kind of person he's dealing with. So let's talk about the Socratic method in general, and then we'll look at more specific examples as we proceed through the texts in which Socrates appears. So the name of the Socratic method of doing philosophy is the elenchus. And elenchus literally means a cross-examination. Here we see many of the previous ideas that we've established about Socrates kind of coming together. Remember, one of the most important things he says is that he doesn't know anything. And the Socratic method proceeds on that basic assumption. It's always the other person, the person Socrates is talking to, who claims to know something. And then by means of this elenchus or cross-examination, it will turn out usually that the person does not in fact know what they think they know. So the Elenkos is a communal search for knowledge. You do this in conversation with someone else. And the goal of this conversation is not just knowledge about the world, but moral knowledge. That's always going to be Socrates' principal interest. Socrates wants to know how to be a good person, how to be a virtuous person. And of course, since virtue is knowledge, then we have to acquire certain knowledge in order to be virtuous, and the knowledge we acquire is in the form of definitions. Definitions of what is holy, what is temperate, what is just, for example. And once we know these concepts, then we can act upon them, so they become a guide to our moral actions. So that's how we bring all the elements together. Someone claims to know about virtue. Socrates says that he wants to learn. The person tells Socrates what they know, and then Socrates cross-examines that person to see if what they've said makes any sense. And we'll see this in great detail in the Euthyphro, where Euthyphro will present himself as a moral expert, an expert in religious matters, especially the issue of holiness. He claims to be an expert on all things that are holy, but as it turns out in the course of the conversation, Euthyphro really doesn't have the first idea of what holiness is. And so this is another aspect of the Socratic method that you often see in these dialogues of Plato, and that is an encounter with Socrates may not be a very pleasant thing, because what ends up happening is that you are revealed in your ignorance, and that can be embarrassing, all right, especially if you have a very prominent role in society, and this cross-examination is taking place in public and can be a very humiliating experience. It's important to keep in mind, however, that Socrates is not just trying to embarrass people. That would be a petty kind of interpretation of what he's trying to do. I think we could say that he is sincere. He is sincerely trying to reach the truth with respect to moral judgments. And he does believe that there is a truth, and that this truth is conceptual, and we get at it through definitions. So this linguistic analysis is the key to the Socratic method. So let's take a look at how a typical Elenkos would proceed in more detail. Our first reading where the Socratic method is emphasized is going to be the Euthyphro, which we're going to be reading next. In the Euthyphro, you get a pretty standard model of a typical Elenkos, a typical Socratic cross-examination. And here I want to just talk to you a little bit about the general details, the general way in which such an encounter takes place, so that when you read the Euthyphro, you could see that as a more specific example of this general approach. So as we know, Socrates has no knowledge, especially moral knowledge. This is what he's looking for. So he's always on the alert for someone else claiming to have knowledge. And of course, as we know, there's no shortage of people who want to tell you what they know in this world. So he will often find somebody who claims to have knowledge, especially about some moral concept that he's concerned with, like holiness or temperance or justice or courage or any of a whole range of morally relevant terms that he wants to have knowledge about. Now, Socrates claims to be ignorant about the matter, but is willing to be instructed. This is an important point. This claim that Socrates makes not to have any knowledge is often referred to as Socratic irony. Ironic because it's not clear whether he does or doesn't actually know. So he may know but be claiming the opposite, which is the essence of an ironic kind of claim. So he claims not to have any knowledge about the matter, but is willing to be constructed. And since the other person has claimed to know, Socrates says, well, then you can tell me. If you know what you're talking about, let's say if you know about holiness, then you can tell me what holiness is by giving me a definition that can stand up to critical scrutiny. So the form of question that Socrates asks is, what is holiness? And the answer that he's looking for is a definition that captures the essence of that concept, that we looked at earlier, right? The universally relevant, essential nature of that particular term. And so the person with whom he's talking proposes a definition of the moral term. And here that's indicated as idea A. So A is the definition that's given. So at this point, Socrates proposes that they examine this definition to see if it makes sense. Is it contradictory, or does it make any sense? Does it fit together with other things we believe to be true, or does it contradict other things that we believe to be true? The only stipulation that Socrates places on this cross-examination is that as he asks the respondent questions, that person must only say what they believe to be true. In other words, this is not intended as the kind of mere verbal wordplay, games with words, if you will, that the sophists were often engaged in. Socrates is not interested in making the weaker argument appear stronger. He wants to get at the truth, and he wants to get at exactly what a person believes. So therefore, they must say what they believe to be true. He's got to have the truth in order for the method to proceed properly. Okay, so in the course of conversing with Socrates, Socrates discovers that the respondent also has another belief, perhaps in the background of their assumptions about the world, something that they take to be true, and this is belief B. So they have proposed a definition A, but they also have a belief B. And what Socrates brings out is that this other thing that they believe, idea B, cannot be held at the same time A is held, that there's something contradictory between the two. You can't believe A and B at the same time. One or the other has to be given up. Now, usually belief B is something that is very deeply a part of the person's belief system, so that they're not easily willing to give up that belief, and therefore the definition of A, the moral term in question, is what gets rejected. Rather than giving up the entire framework of their beliefs, they give up the definition that they proposed. Now, in the Euthyphro, what we're going to see is that this proposal of a definition and its criticism and its ultimate failure is going to be a process that repeats several times until basically the conversation kind of collapses without any resolution whatsoever. And the term for this is aporia. That is, the Euthyphro will be a typical example of a Socratic dialogue because it ends in aporia. It ends without resolution. We're not given a definitive answer to the question of, in this case, what is holiness. The point here is that in the course of this conversation with Socrates, it becomes clear that the respondent does not have the moral knowledge that she initially believed she possessed before the encounter with Socrates began. The Socratic elenchus has both constructive or positive goals and critical or negative goals. The positive goals, the constructive goals, are that it's a method that can help us to acquire knowledge, by definition, of the essence of moral concepts. And the clearer we understand these moral concepts, it seems to me, the more likely we are to be able to act upon them. So the idea that Socrates has of virtue being connected to knowledge is forwarded by this method of investigating people's beliefs. Moreover, I think the method stimulates others to seek out moral truth for themselves, rather than simply presupposing that they already have it. Critically, the elenchus does make others aware of their unclear or contradictory moral beliefs. And this may be part of the hostility that Socrates talks about being created by his method of examining people in public, as people, especially socially prominent people who claim to be paragons of virtue, are interrogated and shown not to know anything about morality whatsoever. One of the other goals that we have visible here is that the Elenchus makes others aware of the need for critical self-examination of their moral beliefs. You simply can't presuppose that you have this knowledge. You have to show that you have this knowledge. And when pressed, most people can't do this. For me, the Socratic method is really ultimately about enlightenment. I think the point that Socrates is trying to make is the following. If you think you are already enlightened, then you won't pursue your own enlightenment. No one looks for what they think they already have. So part of the Elenchus is intended to make us aware that we don't actually have what we think we have. But that's not the end of things. It's only when we become aware of this lack that we will strive to satisfy it and to fill in this gap. We won't fill it in if we don't know it exists. So I think part of what Socrates is trying to get us to do is to take enlightenment generally, our moral life specifically, seriously, and begin to realize that maybe we don't know all that we need to know, and this might motivate us to engage in the kind of deep critical investigation that he thinks is necessary for us to ultimately achieve the goals of enlightenment and moral virtue. I'm going to conclude this discussion of the Socratic method with a look at a few of the criticisms that have been raised traditionally against Socrates' approach. The first and most obvious one is the claim that Socratic irony masks Socrates' real philosophical doctrines. Socratic irony is Socrates' claim that he doesn't know anything. But a lot of critics have argued that it wouldn't be possible for him to ask the kind of insightful questions that he does of his opponents or those he's interacting with unless he knew where the conversation was going or where he wanted it to go, which presupposes that he may have had more knowledge of the moral matters at hand than he's actually letting on. Now, we could possibly respond to this by granting a little bit of the premise, and we could say that it might be possible that Socrates does indeed know a little bit more than the person he's talking to simply because of his experience and previous practice exploring various issues. So, for example, in his conversation with Euthyphro, it might be possible that Socrates has had prior conversations on holiness with other thinkers, and therefore, though he may not know the answer, he may know more than Euthyphro does in the sense of which wrong ways are possible and which answers are more plausible. So we can partially grant that Socratic irony is somewhat disingenuous without having to abandon the claim that Socrates doesn't actually have a complete understanding of the matter about which he's talking. Another criticism is that the Socratic method of cross-examining other people's views, the Elenchus, is merely destructive. That is, it makes people aware of their errors. It gets them to be uncertain about what they took to be the truth, but it doesn't put anything into the place of those false beliefs. So it leaves people in a state of moral confusion. And people who are in a state of moral confusion are likely to be more easily misled than other people who may be completely convinced of their views, which may be wrong views, but at least give their moral personality a certain direction and a certain stability. So that's one possibility, and it's clear that the charge of corrupting the youth must have had something like this in mind, that Socrates goes around training people to undermine traditional morality. And so therefore we could see that the method can be viewed as having a morally corrupting influence on those who are exposed to it, especially to the young. And of course, if young people constantly see that moral authorities actually have no knowledge or can't say what they know, this could lead them to become morally skeptical. It could lead them to the idea that no moral truths can be discovered. which could be damaging to their moral well-being. It's important to keep in mind, I think, in response to these two claims, that these criticisms are the result of perhaps a one-sided interpretation of these Socratic elenchus. It clearly does have its destructive influences or its destructive aspects. From Socrates' point of view, it's important to destroy your false ideas because they cause you harm. It's only after we carry out this critical analysis that we can then clear the ground, so to speak, for constructing a belief system that is based on true foundations, that makes sense, and that is actually the product of critical analysis. So, yeah, partially it is destructive of false beliefs, but the goal, ultimately, as Socrates sees it, is actually the opposite of corruption. The opposite of corruption, in the sense that it's intended to cause us to reflect more deeply on virtue and not just simply accept whatever we happen to hear or whatever our parents or our culture happens to teach us, but to actually examine those beliefs to see if they make sense. And he believes this will make us, in the long run, better, more virtuous people. If his own personality and his own existence can be taken as an example, he's the most critical person that history has ever known, practically, and yet almost everyone who talks about Socrates who knew him from this period of time, people like Plato or Xenophon or others, talk about him as the most virtuous person that ever existed, or at least at that time. So therefore, it's not altogether clear that Socratic method has a necessarily corrupting conclusion. Finally, Aristotle is concerned that the method that Socrates is developing is more suitable for the exactness of science, and that is the model, the rationalistic kind of approach to morality that Socrates takes places a lot of burden on acquiring knowledge, and this knowledge is expressed in terms of very precise moral definitions. Now, Aristotle contends that what Socrates is doing is actually thinking about how the sciences operate, at least science as it was viewed by the ancient Greeks, in which you deduce necessary conclusions from absolutely true fundamental first premises. This requires a very exact definition of the concept at hand. And that method is absolutely appropriate in the science where the goal is to achieve knowledge. But Aristotle contends that in moral inquiry it's not appropriate because moral inquiry, morality in general, does not have the exactness that we find in the natural sciences, which is of course true, but I don't think that we have to give everything to Aristotle on this point, of course. That is, even though moral inquiry lacks the exactness of science, that doesn't mean that such exactness can't form a reasonable goal to strive after. It seems to me that the more precisely we can think about these matters of conduct and action, the better off we will be, the more likely we will be to do the right thing when faced with a situation of uncertainty. So I think that all of these criticisms have valid points, but I think they can be mitigated somewhat by a larger, more complete understanding of what Socrates is up to. So we're not done with Socrates, but this is the end of our general overview of Socrates, his philosophy, and his method. Now we're going to look at specific examples of his philosophy and method as we read the Euthyphro and the Apology, two dialogues written by Plato, because Socrates wrote nothing, in which Socrates plays the prominent role, and we'll see the Socratic method in action and vividly illustrated in those dialogues. So to conclude this presentation on the general features of Socratic method, I'm just going to review at the very end here a few key terms. There's a lot of terminology in philosophy, and a lot of this terminology sounds kind of alien because a lot of it is ancient Greek. However, these are not unusual terms in philosophy, and everyone who studies even the most basic ideas in philosophy should know them. So let's conclude with a brief overview of some of the terminology that we've discussed so far. We looked at Socratic irony. This is the claim that Socrates makes that he does not have any knowledge, which may not be the case. He may be saying that he has no knowledge, but in fact he may have some knowledge. So he's saying the opposite of what is true, and that's being ironic. It's kind of like when it's pouring down rain and you turn to your friend and you say, "What a beautiful day this is." Clearly you're saying the opposite of what is the case, and you are therefore being ironic, but everybody understands what you're saying. The elenchus is the name for the Socratic method. It's the Socratic method of cross-examining a person's beliefs, especially their moral beliefs. Eudaimonia is a very common conception in ancient Greek philosophical thinking. It is the term for happiness in the broad sense. You could think of it as synonymous with a well-lived life. So it's big picture kind of happiness, not transient, incidental happiness. Arete is synonymous with excellence, and is often translated by the English word virtue. Okay, so a person who is morally excellent would have moral arete, so to speak. Episteme is a term for knowledge. It's going to be the root of the term epistemology, which is the theory of knowledge, which we're going to be looking at down the road. In this context, episteme plays the role that in Socratic moral philosophy, virtue requires knowledge. That is, arete requires episteme. In order to be good, you have to know what goodness is. And finally, a term we will become directly familiar with when we read the Euthyphro is aporia. That is, the dialogue doesn't end with a definitive positive answer to the question that it poses. You're not going to get an answer to the question, what is holiness, at the end of the Euthyphro. There is not a definitive result. Part of the reason for this, as we will see, is that it's your responsibility to seek an answer rather than merely have one handed to you. So this is a quick review of the key terms that we'll be pursuing in this section of the class. Review these and quickly review the PowerPoint here before moving on to read the Euthyphro. And there will also be a PowerPoint lecture that accompanies the Euthyphro, which will work you through most of the details. The first time through you may find it challenging, but I think with the help of the lecture, you'll find it quite easy to understand.